Do you like playing EU4? Then you must know there's hundreds of nations to choose from. Picking the right nation has always been a bit hard in EU4. For example, Haida is one of the most boring nations to play because it's so isolated, and there's not much to do, but it can be fun later on. The Ottomans, on the other hand, has a lot happening to it, but perhaps they come a bit too easy after a while, and it's not really a challenge. This brings us onto the nation we are going to discuss today, which is known as Epirus, a minor EU4 nation with 2 provinces in the south of the Balkans. This is perhaps one of the most underrated nations in the whole of EU4, and players tend to get drawn to the nations of Byzantium, Albania, and Wallachia. Skanderbeg and Vlad the Impaler are particularly well known today in their fight against the Ottomans. Epirus sadly doesn't have a leader quite as famous, but in my opinion, this nation is perhaps the most least talked about in the whole of the Balkans, and today we are going to give it the attention it deserves. It wasn't even a nation until the Emperor update a few years ago. We will first discuss the history of Epirus and its origins, finishing with what happened to it at the start of EU4. Then we will talk about the nation in EU4 and a good strategy to play with them. I personally love their unique ideas and mission trees, giving you an exciting campaign. Also, we have a message on why you should subscribe.
Subscribe to the social streamers for eternal salvation.
Right, after hearing that lovely message, let's get into it. The story of Epirus begins at the time of ancient Greece, so as you can imagine, this EU4 nation goes back far. They had an interesting relationship with the Greek city-states, and got involved in the Peloponnesian War, which you could say was an ancient Greek world war between Sparta and Athens. One of their oldest and most famous kings was known as Pyrrhus, a second cousin of Alexander the Great, who became king in 306 BC. Initially, Pyrrhus struggled to keep his throne, and he had to fight a civil war for it. During his reign, Rome had expanded significantly, particularly in southern Italy. This region at the time was home to many Greeks, and had developed a relationship with Epirus. Consequently, Pyrrhus consulted the oracle on whether to attack the Romans, and then sailed over to Italy with 20 war elephants. Let's hope he didn't take too much attrition on the boat. As he landed in the bottom of Italy, Pyrrhus marched upwards and fought the Romans numerous times, and defeated them. This was, however, to be costly victories, and he famously stated, "If we were victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." He therefore couldn't take that many losses in comparison to the Romans, and so he could never sufficiently defeat them. Consequently, although he was amazingly successful, he eventually went home in 275 BC. The Carthaginian leader Hannibal ranked him the second greatest commander the world has ever seen, just behind Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus was known for his benevolence, but as a general, Pyrrhus' greatest political weakness were his failures to maintain focus and to maintain a strong treasury at home. He did also write books on the art of war, inspiring generations to come. It's therefore nice to see that Paradox acknowledges this great leader, and Epirus' first national idea gives you +1 land leader shock, which is dedicated to Pyrrhus' victories. This is perhaps the most famous part of Epirus' history, which is definitely a little dated in comparison to the EU4 start date, but nonetheless it's still very prestigious to have such a great warrior as a national hero and leader. Let's now fast forward to the more modern establishment of this EU4 nation. We now go to the beginning of the 13th century, just after the Fourth Crusade when Constantinople was sacked and Byzantium significantly lost power. In the chaos of this early 13th century power vacuum within the Byzantine Empire, the Crusader Michael Komnenos Doukas went to the city of Arta and founded the Despotate of Epirus. Michael definitely lived life to the full, and he began to conquer territory around Epirus, enlarging his dominion. He, however, was assassinated in his sleep in 1215. Although this was a setback for Epirus, Michael laid the foundations of the Epirot state, and founded a dynasty that would last until 1314. He was also a very popular ruler with his subjects. Perhaps he should somehow be acknowledged more in EU4. So, given the fact that Epirus was a fairly big power in the Balkans around the time of the 13th century, why is it so insignificant in EU4, since it only has 2 provinces, which moves us on to the decline of Epirus? The decline of Epirus began in the mid-14th century, when the Iceni dynasty was wiped out in the Battle of Archelaus. After this, Epirus was then part of the Serbian Empire until 1385. During this time it was weak, and under the control of Albanian clansmen who were unable to establish any real direction or power in Epirus. With the collapse of the Serbian Empire, Epirus was then transferred to Italian nobility, and then eventually to the Tocco dynasty under Carlo I in 1411, which is the dynasty that leads Epirus at the start of E4. Carlo I had to overcome the determined opposition of the Albanian clans, and in particular the ruler of Arta, Jakub Spata. After he dealt with them, Carlo then ruled in relative peace and died in 1429. His nephew, Carlo II, then took over. His succession was not smooth, and Carlo I's illegitimate sons disputed his claim. The Ottoman Sultan at the time, Murad, took advantage of the dynastic chaos and obtained the surrender of Ionia in 1430, after negotiating with the estates. Carlo II was powerless to do anything, and so had to accept the situation. His death in 1448 yet again led to initial weak leadership, with his successor, Leonardo, still being underage. So, 4 years after the start of E4, without a strong leader, Epirus had a regency council. The capital of Epirus, Arta, therefore fell in 1449. It was known that when Leonardo came of age, he was excessively patriotic and wanted to make his nation great again. Leonardo therefore joined the Albanian lord Skanderbeg in throwing off Ottoman sovereignty in 1460. The results, however, were catastrophic, as Leonardo lost 2 of his 3 fortresses on the mainland. Despite having lost control of virtually the entire mainland, Leonardo still had the support of a Latin populace of his former lands, and actively sought to regain them. By the time of the First Ottoman-Venetian War between 1463 and 1479, Leonardo was one of the last independent Latin rulers in Greece. The ongoing fighting had made Leonardo's island a refuge to thousands of Christians fleeing the war. Though much of the surviving evidence does point to Leonardo being a wise and energetic ruler, his realm was plagued by exterior threats in the form of the Ottomans and Venice, as well as internal problems, and proved unable to avoid the Ottoman onslaught, a fate that no Balkan ruler in the 15th century could escape. Over time, therefore, Leonardo concluded that fighting against the Ottomans was futile, and the despotate of Epirus quickly fell to the Ottomans in 1479. Leonardo fled and lived in exile for the rest of his days. Drawing a close to the despotate of Epirus, I think Paradox should add Leonardo as an heir in E4, and since there's quite a lot of information about him, perhaps some events could be added surrounding Leonardo with the Christian refugees. I hope this gives you some context and flavour about Epirus, and maybe you could prevent its destruction, which we'll discuss how to now. So, what's a good strategy with Epirus, since survival is not guaranteed in E4? Well, firstly, you should rival Byzantium, and then try and gain an alliance with Albania. This is probably quite key, as you could potentially get that 3-star general on your side, and then when the time is right, attack Byzantium with other Balkan nations in the region, hopefully taking all the southern Greek Byzantine territories. Once you've done this, hopefully you can gain an alliance with some of the bigger Christian nations, like Hungary or Aragon. Trying to get HRE membership as well might also be a good idea. You need to curtail the Ottomans' power quickly, or most likely, you are going to be destroyed in the later decades. If you need to gain more power, however, Naples could potentially be a good route of expansion for you. Finally, make sure to focus military early on, as you need all the advantages you can get against more powerful neighbouring countries. Well, thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye for now. Shout out to our Patreons: Shadowsinger, Jado52, Kargon, Flyerton, Henriki, Redguard76, and Xiaomi. Your support means a lot, guys.